It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, Quiller Nation, to a very special and fun episode that I'm certain you are going to enjoy. Nic Panagopoulos is the assistant professor of English literature and culture at the University of Athens, Greece. He is the author of The Fiction of Joseph Conrad, The Influence of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and also Heart of Darkness and the Birth of Tragedy, a comparative study. He specializes in comparative philosophical readings of canonical writers, recently having presented a paper at the 2025 Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Connecticut on Socratic component of Hamlet from, of course, an Oxfordian perspective. Our dear friend Earl Showerman, I'm sure, would love the opportunity to spend some time with Nic. And Quiller Nation, we are blessed to have that opportunity right now. Nic, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can we start with me asking you, as a Greek native, a man who obviously knows the Greek masters, obviously knows English literature, and as we will explore later in the conversation, the connection between Plato and Shakespeare, how much was the author of Shakespeare steeped in the Greek classes, do you think?
Well, I think that the answer to that must be that he was extremely well-versed in classics in general, as Earl Showerman's recent book, Shakespeare's Greater Greek, has proved beyond a doubt. Filling an enormous gap in the Shakespeare bibliography on this subject, which has neglected Shakespeare's classical learning and classical education. I would say that Shakespeare's classical, shall we say, knowledge was unparalleled. Only his tutors, when he was young, could possibly compete with it, I think, and in particular Sir Thomas Smith, who was his classics teacher, his Greek teacher, even before he went to Cecil House. I think that Shakespeare was the best educated man in England, if not in the whole of the Renaissance, which means, by definition, that his classical learning was extremely proficient.
Are there any other examples of writers that you find in English literature who you think must have had a similar education and similar access to the classics through their work or through their translation work or their writings, or does this author stand alone in that mastery of, say, knowledge of Plato, Aristotle, the works of Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, etc.?
I think that any great writer, any canonical writer who had a classical education, in other words, anyone who basically lived before the 20th century, which is the watershed, I think, for the classics being a mainstay of liberal education. I think any writer would be comparable in this regard. My own specialism, Joseph Conrad, the author who I've spent most of my life researching from my PhD onwards, had a classical education in Poland, where he was born, and it still had the Germanic curriculum, which was extremely classics based. And although Conrad was a modernist, we can detect very clear signs of his classical education in his works, despite the fact that modernism is a literary movement which one of which goes against much of the Western tradition in terms of the grand narratives, such as Aristotle, Plato, and even the Bible. I think that only in the 20th century can we talk about authors, well-known authors, not having had a classical education, not being influenced by the classics. Shakespeare was simply living at a time when, the Renaissance in England had arrived, largely as a result of his own efforts, actually, so that education in the classics and in the Bible were the two basic pillars of the humanist tradition. So I think that to neglect this aspect of the Western tradition in literature is to misinterpret not only Shakespeare but any other writer that came after him until the 20th century.
I want to dive into your work on King Lear and Plato's Republic, but before we dive into that, I'm curious to know how much you think the works of Shakespeare were influenced by Greek tragedy. You refer to Lear as almost absurdist in its contents, and I agree. It's not quite as absurdist as Titus Andronicus, but I think definitely connected to Greek tragedy in its roots. Where I feel absurdity is used to the most profound effect dramatically. We could even argue that the Gloucester scene in Lear is stolen directly from Oedipus, except our author does something revolutionary in Lear, which is he depicts the violence occurring on the stage instead of off stage, and then a character showing up and telling us about it.
Yeah, I think that there's a clear influence visible, as you say. It's not just the Roman tradition which Shakespeare leans on, which would have been more familiar to the audience and also more prevalent in Elizabethan times, since Latin had an advantage over Greek in the educational system, in the cultural system at the time, and Aristotle was already well established, certainly in relation to Plato, because he appeared in Europe before the Renaissance proper, as a result of the Arabic influence on Europe. In terms of Greek tragedy, I think the signs are very clear. Shakespeare is matching and mixing traditions. That means both the vernacular English tradition, the European humanist tradition, the Latin, if you like, this Senecan tradition, and the Greek tradition, including Aeschylus in particular, also Sophocles, and he's fusing all these traditions together in a way which produces a kind of theatre which is extremely rich in its political and ethical explorations. Because, of course, we're talking about a Protestant culture which is fundamentally at odds with shall we say, the Catholic orthodoxy, which asks no questions fundamentally. We have a Protestant culture which is not only rhetorical but also extremely, shall we say, disputational. And this is clear in Shakespeare's work. We have a, if you like, a dramaturgy which is not only rich but dialectical in exploring the differences between traditions, such as the ones I mentioned, in a fashion which produces a very rich political and ethical tapestry. And as Earl Showerman's book has very, very clearly demonstrated, the allusions to, shall we say, the Oresteia in say Hamlet, and also in Macbeth, are so clear and evident that it is criminal to have neglected them for so long. So there is no doubt in my mind that Shakespeare is working also within that tradition, the Greek tradition of tragedy, Attic tragedy, not exclusively, but also using that as part of his tapestry, the theatrical tapestry.
I almost feel like he had this sense within that he wished he could have lived at that time and competed with those writers in the contests of that day. I feel like he was attempting to write certain pieces, and Lear is I think definitely one of them, where he is trying to create a work that he feels might have been able to win the festival, as it were, back in those ancient times.
Yes, that's a very good. I think that's a very good point, and I think it's absolutely true because I think there is the natural tendency in any ambitious writer to use, but also to surpass his or her sources and his or her influences. Otherwise, there would be no point really in writing if that ambition wasn't there. And with Shakespeare, it's clearly there. Shakespeare was an extremely ambitious writer. The more ambitious the writer is, I think the more effective they are. And Shakespeare is perhaps the most ambitious writer that we have, and hence I think this is one of the secrets of his success. So, as you quite rightly say, he knows the tradition. When I say the tradition, I mean all the different strands of Renaissance knowledge of the classics, and also the vernacular English tradition very well. Chaucer, and all the other great English poets that came before him. So he's aware of the tradition, but he doesn't want to simply continue it or certainly not reproduce it. He wants to surpass it. He wants to add something revolutionary to it. And with well, for example, in Ben Jonson's preface to the first folio, Ben Jonson quite clearly states that Shakespeare, even if Shakespeare was not as educated as he was, he would surpass all the great tragedians of Greece and Rome, and as well as all the all their progeny, which I think is absolutely right, because Shakespeare, he has the qualifications, shall we say, in terms of his education, which was unparalleled, and his intelligence, which all his tutors pointed out when he was being still young in Cecil House. I mean, his tutors were amazed at his ability to learn, and this, I think, was natural for him to place himself within a tradition which he wanted to contribute to and surpass. So absolutely, he saw himself as a competitor, but also as a continuer of Greek tragedy and Greek drama.
Jonson not known for his humility either, by the way, and if anything, the exact opposite. And so I always found it interesting and I feel like Jonson was conceding by being involved in the first folio. He was conceding that Shakespeare had surpassed him and that he was the better writer. Maybe Jonson might have felt he was better at comedy. And certainly that there's an argument possibly there that some of Jonson's comedies can stand up to some Shakespeare comedies and surpass a few of them, because some of Shakespeare's comedies, of course, are not his best writing, but certainly, as you say, he, the greatest tragedian of his day. And for Jonson to not only admit that, but then direct that praise to Shakespeare and to be involved in the first folio to whatever extent he was, I think is certainly an important point.
Yes. There's no humility in a great artist. And this is certainly true of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was not only extremely gifted and from birth, and highly educated as a result of his social position and his circumstances, but he was also very, very proud as an individual, because I think that he was aware of his gifts to a very high degree, and this made him often arrogant, perhaps, and I think justifiably so. that isn't to lessen his shall we say his humanity, because Oxford, if we see Oxford as Shakespeare, Oxford has been demonized by most of his orthodox biographers, at least, as being like the worst villain that has ever lived. And certainly, um, as I say, in accord with what we see from other artists, great artists, there were a lot of flaws in Shakespeare's character. One of them being his arrogance, pride, and so on. And Shakespeare would have been the first to admit it. I don't think that he would have made any secret about this. This is not to lessen his achievement or his, I think, shall we say, the depth of his soul. I mean, if we see him from a Nietzschean perspective, I mean, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, the deeper the soul, the more evil it contained. So, if we have a great artist who is able to, shall we say, tap into the deeper recesses of the human soul by looking into himself, I think that the natural conclusion to draw from that is that he had the full gamut of human potentialities and human shall we say, qualities.
Well, and this is
As we can
consistent
see,
with the great geniuses of history. I mean, this is not an uncommon thing to have a great genius who is so full of flaws that they are demonized or vilified, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. I mean, we can look at what Salieri did to Mozart out of mostly sheer jealousy. We can look at Ben Franklin getting kicked out of France because he couldn't leave the young ladies alone. Thomas Edison was a recluse while he worked and wicked to his wife and children. Ford was a Nazi sympathizer while building the automobile. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The great geniuses of the world do have these character flaws, and we discovered them later, and we have to sort of separate the work from the man. I mean, one of the most recent modern examples would be Michael Jackson, for instance. You know, the genius of the music and the entertainer has to be separated from the character weaknesses and what it appears to be some horrible things that he did while he was alive. And so I think that's consistent, don't you think, with Oxford as Shakespeare?
yes, that's a very good point. To separate the work from the artist, I think we have to do this. In all fairness, because although there is a great deal of autobiography and self revelation in any artist's work, that would be if you like, the foundation of the work. We have to separate the individual from the art, because it would be an injustice to see them always in conjunction, or simply one as a continuation of the other. Because the thing about great artists, or the thing about, shall we say, artists that we love, is this universal voice that they seem to speak through. They have the ability to transcend individual differences in culture and history and class and even gender, and speak to us as human beings. I think this is, as you say, this is typical of all great artists. I mean, for the examples that you gave, I think are very good. And this is why we love them, because they speak to us across time and across space, and they speak to us as human beings, if you like, transcending any social or other differences that we may have.
When in your comparative study of Lear and Plato's Republic, you open the work with a great deal of comparison between Shakespeare and Plato. Plato also, who was demonized and vilified for his work later on, right? I mean, so there's another example. We could point to Socrates and the poison hemlock, right? And there's another example. But you do a lot of comparing Shakespeare to Plato. How and why are they so similar?
I think, as I say in the essay you mentioned, I think that they grapple with the fundamental human problems. I think they're both essentialists in that regard. They believe that human beings have always faced similar social, ethical, political problems, and they're preoccupied with these problems in their work. They're not interested in secondary or relatively, shall we say, peripheral issues. They're interested in the fundamental issues that have arisen transhistorically and transculturally throughout at least Western history. So I think they have similar preoccupations. One of them is, as I write in Justice in the Republic in King Lear, there's the question of justice, but justice seen in a larger sense, not in the legalistic sense, because it meant something different in Plato's time. It meant basically correct conduct in every sense, both to gods and men, but also in interpersonal correctness, as well as political correct behavior.
So we're talking about justice with a capital J, right? Like the concept of justice, not necessarily justice in the courtroom or or a legal decision that falls in favor of the proper argument.
It's justice. Δικαιοσύνη is the Greek word, δικαιοσύνη, and this is the subtitle of the Republic, is on justice, περί δικαιοσύνης, and it means basically correctness. It means correctness in the most general sense of the word. Correct thought, correct deed, correct action, and correct predisposition. And in fact, although Plato narrows it down at the end, he narrows it down to meaning the correct relationship between the different parts of the social and physical organism. He's clearly interested in much more than that. He's interested in the relationship between how we structure, if you like, our society and the kind of relationships that we have with ourselves and with others, and whether that leads to good or bad results. And I think this is very much something which Shakespeare is interested in as well. The structure, the way that the structure of society and the political institutions, if you like, impinge on, affect, and promote certain types of behavior, certain attitudes, which lead to good or bad results. So I think that there's a very strong philosophical, shall we say, interest in Shakespeare, and you could say a kind of intellectual interest in politics, seen from an abstract point of view as well as a concrete point of view.
Does that make him, in your mind, does that make the author a student of Platonism? Is that, would we call him a follower of Plato's philosophy? I think it's evident to some degree that he certainly believes that monarchs need to be philosophers and that the great, all philosophers must be kings and that type of thing. I think we see that again and again throughout the plays where royalty or a monarch or a ruler is depicted.
Yes. This is a point. This is a point of debate. I think we've reached a point where we have to distinguish the two. Plato is approaching these problems from an abstract, idealistic perspective, while being aware of the realities of everyday life and practical politics. But basically, Shakespeare is simply aware of the issues from a Platonic perspective, without necessarily conforming or subscribing or agreeing with Plato. He sees the problems platonically, but he's able to free himself from the, shall we say, confinements or formal restrictions that Plato is subject to as a philosopher. So he's obviously interested in the philosopher king as an idea and the relation between knowledge and political power, and how those two things can converge ideally, or they can never meet. As we see in King Lear, it's very difficult for knowledge and power to come together in any effective way. So he is aware of the arguments. He's aware of the, if you like, philosophical background to these questions, that Plato was the first to, shall we say, crystallize in his work, but he doesn't confine himself to a Platonic solution or a Platonic direction. If you like, he pays homage to Plato. He works with Plato, but is free to explore the issues in a theatrical way or even in a relativistic way. As we see in King Lear, King Lear is a very relativistic play. There are no absolutes at all in the play. This is what makes it so uncomfortable to watch. So he is both a Platonist, but also he's an anti-Platonist, but also he's going further. He's doing much more than Plato can possibly do, obviously, because although we have a dramatic kind of context in both Plato's dialogues and Shakespeare's works, Shakespeare has much more freedom to explore these issues from a practical point of view and a non-theoretical point of view than Plato does.
And if I'm living in 16th century England and I want to get my hands on Plato's Republic, what are the chances that I have of finding a copy of that work in 16th century England? How rare are we talking about? Would a manuscript be? And I'm assuming the only versions that would be available would be in Latin, possibly original Greek. I don't know. But can this writer have absorbed Plato the way that you point out that he has, play with it the way that you describe, transcend it because of his own time and place in the world of history? Is that possible without having the works in your hand? And how readily accessible was that work available in 16th century England?
Yeah, I think this is another crucial question. How much a writer, if we're talking about comparative literature, which is what I do, a very crucial question which we have to at least ask, if not answer, is how much does a writer have the text that we are comparing in front of them and actually working with it in their own, let's say, fiction or drama, and how much that text seeps through their education and their learning, and is simply present in the back of their mind as a kind of intertextuality which is non-specific and shall we say, non-present. It's not actually present in front of them, but they can still somehow, again, they still have access to it through their reading, in a kind of hidden memory, if you like. There's a kind of hidden memory bank which authors can access without even being conscious of it through secondary reading, through secondary sources. So the question is how much, say, a Shakespeare had in front of them was consciously working with a text by Plato, and how much was it part of the general, if you like, zeitgeist, or if you like, the general kind of educational and cultural tradition that they were part of. I think in the case of Shakespeare, I can't say this definitively with other authors, but with my recent work with Shakespeare is that he did have Plato in front of him, and I say this because Shakespeare's, what we know of, if Shakespeare was Oxford, what we know of Oxford's education, first of all, he was, even before his father died, when he was just a very small child, he was sent, as I say, to Sir Thomas Smith, who was a leading classicist of the age in England at the time, to be educated in the classics. And Thomas Smith had these texts in his library. For example, he had Diogenes Laertius' The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, which basically is a compendium of all the classical philosophers. He had Thomas Smith had Plato in Greek. He had a Greek version of Plato from 1534, which he obviously had bought from the continent. And these texts would have been available to the young Oxford. Also, we know that Oxford bought a folio version of Plato at the age of 19. We have these records from actually receipts that Cecil had in his possession, in which he bought Latin translations of Plato. when Oxford was 19. So there can be no doubt that if Shakespeare was Oxford, and we believe that he was, and I think all evidence suggests that he was, but there can be no doubt that Shakespeare had these texts in front of him, and therefore there's no reason why he should not have actually been working with them if we find textual evidence of this in the actual plays. And I think we do find. I mean, Earl's book is quite clear about this. There is so much textual evidence of classical learning of all sorts, not only philosophy, but also drama and myth and so on. And my work too suggests the same. My recent paper on Socrates and Hamlet shows that he must have been consciously working with a Socratic model in his mind, and so it's not just indirect Neoplatonic, if you like, influences. We're talking about direct Platonic influences because he had access to his works.
And I would argue that part of that influence comes from that young boy being sent off to this great tutor and having access to these great works with the idea that he is going to inherit the second oldest title in the land, that he is duty bound to become a philosopher king of sorts throughout his life. And that's why the education. You're going to be the 17th Earl of Oxford someday. You need to go and learn these things, and you need to go and learn how to be a proper courtier, and you need to learn the ins and outs of government. You need to learn the ins and outs of law. You need to be able to carry yourself correctly at court, accept your responsibility, govern your lands appropriately. I mean, I would think that that's in like a seed is planted in the young mind of a young earl at such an early age, and it doesn't disappear. It doesn't go away. In fact, now he's reading Plato in original Greek. Then later on, as he matures, he goes and gets his own version in Latin, and it sticks with him. It's a part of his fabric now, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Stephen. I think as a result of the Renaissance man, if you like, ideal. That every noble, every aristocrat would have been educated in this idea of the Renaissance man, especially if they were part of the nobility and part of the court. As you say, Oxford's family was the second highest ranking aristocratic family in the land. The idea that they have a responsibility, a social responsibility to firstly educate themselves to the highest degree, and then to apply their learning in practical politics for the good of the realm, for the good of the land. I think that's absolutely correct what you say. And Shakespeare, Oxford, clearly had this sense of responsibility, this social responsibility as a result of his title and as a result of his family history. So I think that's a very good argument in favor of the influence of a writer like Plato or Aristotle on a young boy, on a young man, learning the world and becoming educated in affairs of state, ethical and political issues, which were part of his social and cultural milieu. They were the lifeblood of the aristocracy. That's what a person of his rank had to, if you like, concern himself with. So I think you're absolutely right in that sense. And this is a very strong motivation in the case of Shakespeare. If we identify him with Oxford, to be the best version of himself. This means immersing himself in the idealistic tradition, which means basically Plato, because that was it. I mean, that was politics in the most ideal sense, was Plato's Republic and the laws and the symposium. So Shakespeare, as Oxford, would naturally want to become very familiar with these works and be, if you like, elevated by his education in his works.
Well, I think across the board throughout history, the great debate has been whether Hamlet or Lear or either one, and it depends on who you talk to, I guess. But which one is the greatest tragedy of all time. And I think the fact that those two stand supreme above everything else is a very telling debate. Just the fact that we have that debate, well, is it King Lear, is it Hamlet? Is it Hamlet, is it King Lear? I think tells us everything we need to know about the quality of the writing and the author. But when we look at it from this Platonic perspective that you have shared, it really, for me, makes total sense why a play like King Lear gets written. Why this author chooses to create a mythological England to use as a metaphor to ask profound philosophical questions about justice, about power, and I believe also about the obligation that I believe Plato puts forth as sort of the purpose of the philosopher king. And to me, it doesn't make any sense that some country grain dealer would even be interested in any of this at all, let alone create this mythological England to ask these profound philosophical questions and make these statements about justice and power and duty and honor,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without, how can we comment on as you say, a merchant from Stratford having any access or interest in these matters? I mean, we can't even speculate about it. It's completely absurd. But if we're talking about Oxford as being the author, then it makes absolute sense. I think there are two aspects of Shakespeare's work which are always present in the plays. The first is the general philosophical, ethical exploration, which someone like Plato, a writer like Plato, would definitely be part of, and learning, and if you like, education in the classics would definitely be part of. On the one hand, on the other hand, Shakespeare is also writing critiques, very specific critiques of his own time and his own, if you like, court, the power structure in Elizabethan England, the monarch, her advisors, her courtiers, and all the internal politics of Elizabethan England, which he was in the perfect position to if you like, explore and to reveal in code form in these plays. So there's two aspects of his work. One is the more universal, theoretical, philosophical, you could say, aspect, as you very well described, of, let's say, these fundamental political questions which Lear asks in the context of a mythical England, which of course is not a mythical England, is actually Elizabethan England in disguise, which is that's leading to the second aspect of the work, which is always topical and satirical, and has a lot of reference to actual eight political actors in Shakespeare's time. So it's a combination of these two things, and it's a most incredible combination of the topical, the specific allusions, and the universal themes and problems which Shakespeare explores that make these plays so incredibly rich. Because if it was only one or the other, it wouldn't have the effect that they have.
Well, and in that sense, I believe and I feel that Oxford places himself into the text as the fool. And that is his personification in that play. And I think it's also the reason why the fool just suddenly vanishes before the play is over. He has said everything he needs to say, and now we're going to watch the denouement, as it were, the unraveling of this knot that has been created in order to then prove the final points at the end. And of course, through the great suffering of the characters that are involved, both good and bad in the story, if you can even define them as good and bad, because I think a lot of the protagonist characters in Lear have their own flaws and problems, which is very true about a lot of Shakespeare protagonists and leading characters. But it's a really incredible journey that he's taking the audience on through that play, and I think in a very unique way that we don't see in the other works.
Yes, I think that King Lear is probably the play which contains the most soul, shall we say, wrenching, the most soul revealing Oxford or Shakespeare that we have in any, in even more than Hamlet. I mean, Hamlet is relatively mild in this regard. There's so much suffering in King Lear, as you say, and by all the characters. I mean, no character escapes suffering, and usually the suffering is either unwarranted or it's unequal to the just the deserts of the character. So it's a very painful experience, which means that it expresses all the pain, if you like, it instills all the pain of the author, and the pain of life, if you like, the pain of existence is instilled in that work. If we're talking about particular representatives, I think that obviously Shakespeare, Oxford, sees himself in the fool, as you quite rightly say. He does this throughout his plays. And for example, I mean, he's also Puck in the Midsummer Night's Dream, and often the fool is a character that Shakespeare projects himself into simply because he sees the theatre as the fool's paradise, as the fool's kind of kingdom, where truths can be told in a playful way, in a way which might be thought-provoking without being offensive, or in a kind of catalytic way. The fool plays that role throughout his I think his work. And definitely in Lear, I mean, the fool, as you say, is a very tragic character, because we have reached a point where the truth is just so painful and so rare, rarely spoken and rarely heard, that, I mean, it's like an anomaly of nature to speak the truth, and the costs of doing so are enormous. And I think, as you say, the fool represents this. But then there's this other aspect of the idealistic aspect of Shakespeare, which is present, as you say, in the idea of the philosopher king. So you have the fool on the one hand representing the theatre as an institution and as a kind of as a form of play, and then you have the more serious projections on the philosopher king. For example, there's Edgar, who is a nobleman, and he does the right thing throughout the play at enormous personal cost, eventually becoming the king. So this is also Oxford. This is also Shakespeare. He's both a fool and Edgar. He's both a philosopher king who doubles as a kind of John the Baptist, kind of raving about good and evil in the most.
That's a great example. Yeah.
Sense. Yeah. So. So I think Shakespeare, and Nietzsche said this, actually, again, going back to Nietzsche, he said that if you think that Shakespeare only identifies with the good characters or the happy characters or the powerful characters, you're wrong, because Shakespeare is projecting himself in every single character in his work. So he's also Macbeth, he's also this villain, he's all the characters, together. The aspects he can see aspects of himself, and he projects aspects of himself in all the characters in the plays. So he's also Edmund. You could say that Oxford is also Edmund. Like criticizing the institutions of his time from a sophistic or from a relativistic perspective. So. But in some obviously more than others. So certainly the fool, as you say, and Edgar is clearly there's a projection of Shakespeare there as the philosopher king or the jester.
Well, he loves to give his villainous characters reasons to be villains, and almost to the point of trying to justify their actions, right? Like Iago goes into great explanation as to why he hates Othello and why he wants to destroy Othello. Edmund explains to us why he needs to act the way that he believes he needs to act in order to overcome the bastard title and tag. Don John in Much Ado About Nothing has the same problem. He's jealous of his brother. He's jealous of Claudio, who is his brother's chosen, favorite. We get a lot of explanation from villains as to why they're villainous. Richard III, who tells us, dogs bark at me, and so if everyone sees me as wicked, then I might as well just be wicked. There's a lot of that happening, isn't there? On both sides with him. So yeah, I think that's a good point. In your essay, you cite and quote so many previous students of Shakespeare. And I use that term because I believe that once we think we are no longer students of Shakespeare, then we sort of shut ourselves off to learning. I feel that's true about just about everything. I tell actors that too. Like, I'm a student of theater. It doesn't matter how many plays I've directed, how many starring roles I have performed. I am still a student of this craft. And if I cease being a student of the craft, I will stop learning and I will stop improving. But you cite these students of Shakespeare whose query and who have stated magnificent things about the writer they believe is the man from Stratford. How do you think, how do they justify their inquiry and their discovery with that orthodox narrative, do you think? How is that even possible in a rational, intelligent mind who comes upon these revelations like you have, that, okay, this was a big Platonic influence here, and so it cannot have been what they say it is. It has to have been someone else, which leads you to Oxford. How is it possible that the whole world isn't being led to Oxford through these revelations and studies?
Yeah, that's another very good question, Stephen. And it's a painful question because before I became an Oxfordian, I became an Oxfordian about 10 years ago after watching Roland Emmerich's film, fantastic film, Anonymous, the 2011 film. I saw it, I think, in 2014. And it was a religious experience for me. It completely changed my world because I had been a student of Shakespeare, as you say, since I was very, very young. I had the good fortune of having an English education. Although I was Greek, I grew up in England. My education is fully English, and I'm bicultural in that respect. My English is my native tongue, although my family and my culture is Greek. I'm educated in the English system, which placed a lot of emphasis on Shakespeare, as you know, and I was very fortunate in that regard because I studied Shakespeare, and then I went and I learned Shakespeare at school. I did Shakespeare for my O-level exams, and then I went to university. I studied English and drama, like yourself. I have half of my degree was in theatre. We didn't do Shakespeare then. We did a lot of other playwrights, but not Shakespeare because he was so well known. But I have also the theatrical background there. And I have acted in Shakespeare plays, performances. So I've had a long history in Shakespeare. He's part of my personal culture, and I love him dearly. And then I had this incredible experience, as I say, watching Roland Emmerich's film, which completely blew my mind, to put it, colloquially. And before then, I was teaching Shakespeare as people teach Shakespeare today. They were speculating that Shakespeare may have been a grammar school, pupil. He may have even taught at the Stratford Grammar School. He may have gone to London and held the horses at the theatre door, and then he may have started writing poetry. And then, it's all this speculative biography which has been passed down to us, unfortunately, as gospel. And because Shakespeare has this religious dimension, he's like a kind of deity. Not only in terms of literature, but in terms of culture, universal kind of culture. He's kind of a god. You can't question his identity. And I think it's a kind of groupthink which people fall into, and it's true of anything, a lot of things in history which I think we are taught as being, fact, when in fact they're not. If you ask deeper questions, you realize that a lot of the history which is taught in various places is fiction. And unfortunately, a lot of the history which is taught about Elizabethan England is fiction as a result of this misidentification of the author of the works of Shakespeare. And I came to this realization after watching this film, which is this fantastic film, which made me want to learn more, and I went to various websites. For example, Stephanie Hughes' fantastic website called Politic Worm was my first kind of entry point into Oxfordianism, and she is the most erudite, the most incredible scholar of Elizabethan England, because she doesn't just explore the identity of the author, she explores everything related to Elizabeth's England and the culture of the time in relation to the real author's identity. So I went to her website, and then eventually I arrived at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, which is very rich in material, and that has completely changed my life. I mean, literally, because Shakespeare is such an important part of my life. This realization that the man that I was teaching before to undergraduates, and I assumed was the Stratford man who simply had to be a natural genius, I realized that this could not have been the case. It would have been impossible. But you need a certain impetus, a certain, shall we say, a kind of shock to the system to actually reach that point where you can dismiss the propaganda, basically, which and the myth which has been created around the false author.
Well, I think it's interesting that
unfortunately,
you
I'm not
mentioned
very
that
optimistic about actually changing it, at least within our lifetime. But this the education system. I think if one is in education or in theatre, that would be a good way to begin to change people's perceptions of this. So in my teaching, I emphasize the authorship question, and I emphasize the absurdity of the traditional attribution of the plays. But even if we don't manage to turn the tide and actually convince people, because the interests are so enormous, the financial and cultural and professional interests against us are so powerful, even if we don't eventually manage to prove that Oxford was the author, the experience of exploring the life of Oxford as the author of Shakespeare's works, and the way that this transforms our understanding of Elizabethan England and the whole concept that we call Shakespeare, is so stimulating and so inspiring and so mind-expanding that I would gladly do this for the rest of my life without ever changing anybody's opinion.
Well, I think everybody knows where I stand on it. We're about to complete our 7th season of this podcast series, and I'm already booking guests for season 8. So I'm committed. I'm in it to win it.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned you described seeing the Roland Emmerich film, and I've been blessed enough that we actually have an episode where John Orloff, the screenwriter, was a guest of the program, and we got to talk about the movie quite extensively. I think it's interesting that you mentioned it as a sort of religious experience, and at the same time, you mentioned that Shakespeare, the Orthodox version, is sort of this like religious icon that people sort of bow down at the altar of. And that kind of connects to my next question about your essay, where you sort of connect the philosophies of Lear and the Republic in a way that's almost a conflict, especially obviously not in the Republic, but the foundations there. This sort of conflict between pagan and Christian belief systems that is particularly profound in the play. Lear is set in a pagan fictional time and world, almost very ancient Greek in nature, I would argue. And then it often has characters referring to very Judeo-Christian aspects, no?
Yeah, I think I discussed this in the essay. There's a kind of ethical confusion which King Lear reflects in its plot and its characters, which I think has something to do with the particular historical moment that Shakespeare is writing that play, by which I mean the transformation of English culture from a Catholic kind of traditional Christian culture to a more modern capitalist post-feudal culture. I think that is clearly reflected in the ethical confusion and the ethical plurality that we find in King Lear. Which is very confusing on the surface, but I think that what Shakespeare was trying to do was show how confused people were actually in his age as a result of these enormous and very, 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 very fast cultural changes that were taking place due to the Protestant Revolution and the Tudor push for, if you like, the abolition of the Catholic Church in England. events that Shakespeare experienced while he was young and his culture was going through was so traumatic, I think, that the pagan element is basically a metaphor for the destabilization of traditional Christian beliefs. And I think that's the role that the pagan element plays in King Lear. It's a metaphor for the doubt, the profound institutional, if you like, as well as ethical doubt, and insecurity, which Shakespeare's audience, Shakespeare's culture was going through. So I think that the pagan, if you like, challenge to the orthodoxy, the religious orthodoxy that we find in that play, with characters who seem to be inspired by values which have nothing to do with Christianity. I think that was, if you like, a way for Shakespeare to point to the radical destabilization of culture as a result of the Protestant Reformation, primarily, but also the end of the feudal system and the ideological repercussions for that.
I don't know that I've ever really looked at it that way, and that's a really interesting concept that when Henry, for all intents and purposes, destroys the Catholic Church in England, he's doing it. We always talk about how he's doing it for his own lustful reasons, because he wanted a divorce and he wanted Anne Boleyn and he wanted to make sure he could have an heir. But we tend to forget about the economic reasons behind it, and you sort of spark an idea in my head that sort of becomes like the catalyst for capitalism to take over in a way that it's all about money grubbing at that point, as opposed to a higher power or a higher purpose or a higher calling. I never even thought of it that way, but that's a very interesting shift and change, isn't it, that occurs and then permeates throughout the world, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that Christianity is beginning to feel the tremors of what we today have experienced very, very much, which is the questioning of the Bible as the source for, if you like, of ethical certainty and ethical value. I think that was beginning in Shakespeare's time, and I think that's what the pagan element represents, and it's reflected in these opportunistic neo-pagan characters who are not interested in, as you say, the right conduct and the ideal kind of virtues that one should have, and so on. And they're only interested in self-advancement, which is not to say that's the only thing that was characterizing classical politics. Not at all. The Platonic tradition is very much against this sophistic, self-interested view of ethics, which the capitalistic characters display in King Lear. But there's very much this idealistic versus realistic perspective on ethics, which if you like, is brought to a head in King Lear.
That type of conjoining of belief systems, to my mind, is just a different level of genius. It's just a remarkable level of genius that all of that's going on inside the mind of this man while he is dipping pen to inkwell and scratching out these lines and this story that I have to believe. I've done some writing of my own in my life, and the best stories, the best characters tell you their story, and you are forced to write it down. You are compelled, or maybe the better word is impelled from within, to tell these the stories of these characters. And I think that's what we see in this play. I think that the level of genius represented there not only demonstrates a great knowledge of Plato and Aristotle and Aeschylus and Sophocles, but I think also, as you say, a great understanding of biblical teaching and the political aspects of the realm at the time, the great changes that are occurring not only in England but on the continent as well because of what England has done and the whole heretic queen that is Elizabeth. And I mean, it's just a phenomenal collection of thought processes that had to go into this work, that I have trouble, and I've read the play multiple times. I haven't produced or directed it yet. It's hard to find a good Lear. But reading the play multiple times, and I still don't know it the way I want to know it.
Yeah. I mean, reading the Republic, that particular essay, Justice in the Republic. Reading the Republic, I came to that topic from another project, which was the conflict between nature and law in King Lear, and then I started reading Plato in relation to that, because it had to do with the sophists. It's the sophists basically who were Plato's enemies that were exploring this dichotomy between the law and nature, the law of man and the law of nature. And I eventually went to the Republic, and I realized that these debates are actually conducted in the Republic itself. That the dialogue is exploring precisely these debates that you're discussing. We're discussing the difference between realpolitik, a kind of practical politics, a kind of cynical politics that's Machiavellian, you could say, in Shakespeare's time, and an idealistic political theory, or a kind of idealistic view of politics, which Plato favors through Socrates. This is exactly what Plato is actually debating in the Republic. He hasn't reached any kind of absolute clarity in that regard. It's very dialectical, the whole business, in that he's asking questions which don't have a clear answer, and Socrates doesn't give a clear answer to. Not only in the Republic, most of the dialogues don't actually achieve any absolute certainty at the end. Something which sounds shocking, because we imagine Plato as the great clarifier, the great kind of crystallizer, and the philosopher who favors certainty. In fact, certainty is dialectical in Plato. So you have thesis, antithesis, which produces a new synthesis, which then becomes contradictory and needs to go through the process again. So there's a dialectical relation between certainty and uncertainty, knowledge and if you like, and opinion in Plato, which is very Shakespearean, because Shakespeare is not going to teach us what the truth is. He's going to explore these questions without actually arriving at any definite conclusion, because life doesn't arrive at any definite conclusion. So it's the experience itself which is important, not answering these great questions. It's asking these questions on a different level, asking these questions dialectically, which is of value, not actually answering them, because that's not the business of certainly of theatre, and it's not the business actually of the Platonic dialogue. Paradoxically, because we imagine Plato as being the great essentialist, in fact, Plato is very dialectical. He doesn't want to tell us what's what. He's not going to reach a definite conclusion, even with his obsession with the strict definitions and clear knowledge of ethical truths and so on. He's actually very dialectical. So there's a lot of drama going on in Plato itself, which is reflected in Shakespeare, and vice versa. It's these great thinkers are actually dialecticians. They're not teachers of ethics. That would be a wrong way to see them. They don't teach us anything. We learn from what we experience through reading the plays or reading the dialogues.
So Plato is the great soliloquizer, right? It's all one big giant soliloquy, thinking out loud, very much like the Hamlet of his time, isn't he? He's asking the questions, whether that question is to be or not to be, or whatever the question is, right? He's asking the questions, not giving the answers. And it's through us pondering those questions that we find our own answers. We seek our own truth. Is that basically?
Yes, that's absolutely true, because education is not. This is something that Aristotle also says, but it's basically Socratic. Socrates says that I cannot teach anyone anything. I can only help them to think. I can only train them in the act of thinking critically, which encapsulates what you say.
It's unfortunate that so many of our learning institutions in modern times have come so far away from that philosophy, and you have so many professors who are, teaching in the classroom, drilling thoughts and opinions and perspectives into their students rather than guiding them to their own inquiries and their own exploration and discovery. It's a shame how far we've come in that sense, I would say.
Yeah, I think this says it all. What you just described is the malaise, is the modern disease in the education system, that we no longer see education in the liberal sense, the traditional humanist sense of exploring one's own potential or reaching one's own conclusions as a result of critical thought. But we see education now as a functional thing, as a training in doing some job or making money, and that's so fundamentally anti-humanist. It so fundamentally goes against the whole Western tradition, beginning with Socrates, let's say, and ending, in the liberal educational system of Western, of the Western canon, which is under attack. I mean, history is bunk, and they don't want to teach history at school. They don't want to teach history at university. They don't want to teach classics anymore because they see it doesn't make money. It doesn't apply to any particular social arena. But that's the whole point. Education is not about that. Education is exactly the way you describe it. Is the cultivation of the soul, which is exactly what Socrates is about. He's encouraging his listeners to look at their soul and to cultivate this, to enrich it. And Plato is a follower of this, and he promotes this, as does Shakespeare. Shakespeare is promoting the cultivation of the soul, which is the Socratic art.
Well, and when we look at the Greek masters and we see, the concept of justice with a capital J, as we've been discussing, and we see the myths and the tragedies of the ancient world, and we find this pattern of sort of the moral lesson, which is that if you step outside of the line, if you go beyond the bounds, if you make these terrible mistakes, it will lead to great suffering, not only yours, but the suffering of others. And I think what we find in Lear, as you pointed out earlier, these characters who suffer beyond what they deserve in many ways. I mean, Gloucester getting his eyes plucked out is one of the big ones, obviously, right? But the hanging of Cordelia, the pain that Lear must go through at the hands of his own daughters, and then the loss of a child before him whom he loves most. All of that is that sort of, do you think, the writer's homage to the Greek classics and the masters who came before?
Clearly King Lear has an element of extreme suffering, and Aristotle says in the Poetics that tragedy is the experience or the representation of extreme suffering, and that's clearly true of Lear. So I think there's a conscious imitation going on, which is what you're suggesting, and I can't disagree with that. You're absolutely right. I mean, Gloucester's eyes being taken out. Obviously, this is a reference to Oedipus.
And Oedipus doesn't deserve it, right? I mean, he does it to himself, so that there's a big difference there. Exactly. He does it to himself, but he doesn't deserve that fate. When you look at that story, I always think of that story as, he's done everything he can to avoid that fate, and unfortunately falls right into it anyway. And the great suffering that he endures is not fair to him. It's not right to him. Antigone, of course, is another great one. She is the just character in the story. And Unfortunately, though, she doesn't learn anything from her father's fate before her, like 15 years earlier type of a thing in the storyline. Creon is really the villain throughout the entire sequence in a lot of ways to me. And he does have his own suffering, and he loses two sons, but I just feel like that Shakespeare is sort of like touching on that foundation and saying it is only through this type of depiction that great tragedy exists. And in the keeping along the lines of Aristotle, the greatest form of art ever, like the greatest form of human art. And the catharsis necessary to truly enjoy the art is an important thing. I think he truly understands beyond any other writer of his day, and even for decades after him.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point that out. It can only, a play like King Lear can only be explained in terms of catharsis, like Antigone. And Antigone is a very good example because Cordelia is Antigone, as well as various other possible tragic heroines. But Antigone would be the closest from the Greek repertoire that you could compare her to, and her death is similar to Antigone's death in its pointlessness and its kind of futility, having established her as a kind of ethical position that we have to at least acknowledge the validity of her ethical position. She sacrificed herself for that position, producing pity in the audience. And Aristotle says that fear and pity relates to, which are the basis of catharsis, produce catharsis, relates to suffering which is on the one hand justified, on the other hand unjustified. So we pity the character who makes a mistake. Let's say Cordelia makes the mistake of opposing her father in the love test, and then she suffers throughout the play as a result of this. So this combination of making a mistake and also suffering unjustly simply because of fate. So it's the combination of this just and unjust suffering, but always to a high degree, to a very heightened degree, which produces catharsis, which is the essence of tragedy according to Aristotle, the way that he analyzes the existing tragedies of his day. That's how he explains their effect. And King Lear is absolutely on that kind of wavelength. But it goes even further. The point of King Lear is that there is no comparable tragedy in the sense of the questions, the painful questions which he asks, which cannot be answered. For example, why at the end of the play is there no kind of ethical compensation given to any of the characters, Lear or Cordelia, or why is it so painful? Why does it have to be so destructive to all the characters? So this is a question that goes beyond the theory of catharsis. It's such a harrowing experience. You could it's kind of catharsis on steroids. It's just.
Well, I don't know. What about Titus Andronicus? Do you feel like maybe that's an earlier version of this homage to the Greek masters? I mean, there are more allusions in that play than there are in any other play, and then obviously the violence gets very extreme in that play. And when you talk about onstage violence depicted, whether it's the slitting of the throats of the two sons after they've raped and maimed his daughter, and then him, snapping her neck near the end after feeding the two sons. Like the amount of the body count at the end of that play is nearly equal to or more so than the Lear body count. The only difference is we do sort of have this, I don't know if I would call it a happy ending, but this weird sort of change in the shift where Lucius at the end of Titus says, I'm going to break this cycle of murder and revenge, and I'm going to raise the child of Aaron and Tamra to be my own, and put an end to the death and the suffering and the destruction. So there is sort of that little like I don't know, dot on the exclamation point at the end of that play. But how would you feel? Like, is one before the other? Are they compendium plays in any way, do you think?
I think they belong fundamentally to different traditions. I think Titus Andronicus, as a result, I mean, as you can see from the title and the context, is a Roman play. It's influenced more by the Senecan tradition, which emphasizes the bloodlust or the lust for revenge that the Roman tradition typifies, and we see it in let's say Laertes in Hamlet represents that part of the tragic tradition more in relation to the Roman works. But King Lear has some of that violence in it, that typically Senecan violence, but it's more Greek in the sense that it emphasizes more the existential aspect of suffering than the actual physical aspect of suffering. So a big difference between the Roman and the Greek tradition is that violence is not is narrated, but is not shown on stage in the Greek tradition. So you don't see Agamemnon being stabbed on stage, and you just see the effects of that. It's reported as having happened off stage. And Titus Andronicus is very much in the Roman tradition in the sense that it does actually represent all these violent acts. And the difference is that the Greek tradition on art and also drama in particular was idealistic. What does that mean? It means that it mustn't show the low aspects of human nature on stage. It must try to elevate the viewer, the audience, to a better state, and that means that it mustn't dwell on the actual physical aspects of the violence or the suffering.
So this is why Electra and Orestes go into the hut and lure Clytemnestra into the hut, and then they come out and she's dead, and we just understand that they have slain her. We don't actually see them wielding the sword together.
That's right. So the point of that difference between the Roman and the Greek tradition is that the Greek tradition doesn't want anything to detract from the existential, ethical questions, which blood would do on stage. It doesn't want to distract the audience's attention to something physical in the way that the Roman tradition does. To emphasize the suffering and to emphasize the injustice or to enhance the fear produced by the performance, the Roman tradition actually goes, to great lengths to show the blood and the gore, and that is, you could say, is transferred to modern Hollywood. I mean, you have like the modern Western paradigm, which is one in which blood and violence, the more the merrier. But the Greek tradition is fundamentally at odds with that.
Well, I feel like there's sort of a lowest common denominator aspect to that when you're dealing with, so obviously, the Greeks, everyone speaks Greek. Sure, there was some migration of other cultures into the Greek culture at that time, but not very much. Whereas in Rome, it's this, cosmopolitan city of its day, and you have multiple cultures, multiple languages. And so entertainment needs to be appealing to everyone, regardless of whether they speak the language. I think that's one of the things we see about Shakespeare is, even though we have tons of Italian influences, and there are even some words that are obviously influenced through French and Spanish and Latin and even Greek and some Hebrew, I would argue even as well. For the most part, the whole concept there's this standardized English language, and it's being performed for an English audience as part of its sort of I don't want to say homogenous culture, but certainly more homogenous than we could look at ancient Rome, for instance, or as you mentioned, today's modern Hollywood. They're making movies and they want to show them all over the world. They just dub in whatever language. But things like slapstick comedy and violence are universal. They can be understood by everybody, right? I mean, isn't that like the Plautian comedies were very much the same thing, which leads to sort of the commedia tradition of everyone can understand the situation that's happening, even if you don't speak the language.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would see this in terms of cultural history, in the way that although Rome represents the development of Greek culture and was obviously inspired by Greek culture and tries to continue some of that, it goes much further. So we have the emphasis in shall we say, in ancient Rome is more on the question of power. And by that I mean institutional power, primarily the power of the state, as opposed to the individual, the citizen, which in Greece tries to achieve some kind of ideal balance between these two things. Like the citizen and the state in a democracy have some kind of balance, which is lost when we arrive in Rome, and we see this in the buildings. For example, I mean the buildings the Pantheon in Rome is designed to intimidate the viewer. If you stand in front of it, you feel like an insect, and that's deliberate because of the emphasis which Roman civilization plays on the power of the state, of the Roman state. In contrast, say, with democratic Athens, which is a very kind of humanizing, humanistic kind of institution that tries to elevate the individual or the citizen to a position of they are participants in the political process. In contrast with what you have in one, with the clear distinction between the institutions and the citizens themselves, and we see this emphasis on power, institutional power, state power, gradually, if you like, seeping into not only Western culture more and more, moving away from Athens towards Rome. And for example, I mean, in the U.S. Senate, I mean, the symbols in the U.S. Senate are Roman imperial symbols. I mean, it's clear that they are modeling themselves not on Athens but on Rome, because they have the fasci, on the walls, and they have all these emblems of power and state authority, which is emphasized. And I think this is the fundamental difference, which is reflected in the experience of watching, say, a Senecan tragedy, which shows the brutal kind of force of the monarch, of the emperor or the soldier, in contrast with something which is much more human and much more kind of, how should I put it, more civilizing in the Athenian example.
Yeah, that's a really brilliant point, and I didn't think about the modern context of it, and certainly the founding fathers of America established a republic. They were very Platonic in certain ways, weren't they?
Yes,
and it's no wonder then when you look at almost 250 years of history of the United States, it's becoming more and more Roman every day, I would argue.
yes, absolutely, Stephen. Yeah, absolutely. So they have the inspiration from the Greeks, and they have the original impetus, as you say. Founding fathers in particular, I mean, they were very Greek educated, as you say, and there was the debate whether the American Republic would speak Greek. They had this vote about which language would be adopted by the Republic, and eventually English won out by one vote, I think it was, as opposed to Greek. Yeah, so there is this foundation in Athens, but it goes further as history progresses towards the Roman model.
Well, and I guess in a sense, that's sort of the risk of the melting pot, and that's something that as I'm pointing out, that's something that our author didn't really have to consider or deal with. The continent was full of independent nations, and there wasn't and there was a lot of ambassadorship going on, and it was important that you speak multiple languages at that level. But as far as the common audience for entertainment, it was pretty homogenous. It was, this will appeal to this audience, and I don't have to think about making sure that the masses are going to enjoy it in a way that we see, sort of, I always say the fall of the Roman Empire was the fall of entertainment. When it starts becoming chariot races and gladiatorial combat, you should start to watch for the end. And then, here in our country, we have NASCAR and MMA fighting, and those are like the two most popular entertainments. And you start to wonder, okay, what slippery slope are we on?
Yes, Shakespeare has a lot of relevance here.
Yes. And so all the more reason why we need to develop a resurgence in the Western world for the classics and how they connect to the works of Shakespeare and how the works of Shakespeare connect to the classics. And I think we might be doing a great service to society by continuing to pursue this topic in a way that if it helps re-engage people with these works to help them want to better understand how they connect together, I think that it's a double positive for us. One, it's going to help reveal the true author, or at least at the very minimum prove that it could not have been some country guy who would have never had access to any of these works. But also I think it helps to elevate society as much as it possibly can through the great art. And I think, then we tie that back to Aristotle and his Poetics and yes, and we tie that to Plato and the Republic, and yes, and we need more of that in the world, not less.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something which I very, very firmly believe in: the power of education, the liberal tradition of education, and its social value. In exactly the way that you describe it, I believe this very much. I come from a very academic family. Both my parents were classicists. My father was an expert on Plato, actually, and Thucydides. And my mother, she's still alive. She's an expert on Aristotle and Demosthenes. So I was very fortunate in having these role models. And I want to continue. I want to, if you like, pass this tradition on to my students and who I see as my children, basically. Because I think this is extremely valuable for them. And the difference between, let's say, the Greek tradition and the Roman tradition, which has unfortunately dominated Western culture, is the difference between respecting the individual human being and seeing them as being part of a kind of homogenized or kind of undifferentiated mass of subjects of power or subjects of an empire. In this case, I mean, we're talking about America. We're talking about the modern empire, and when we're talking about an empire, then education must be suitable for the, here we say, the ruling, to promote the ruling ideology and the interests of the empire, and that's why we have the kind of art that we have today being produced, say, by places like Hollywood. And as you say, I mean, popular culture is definitely going in that direction more and more, so that there's less respect for say traditional, no, so we say humanistic values, which were promoted, I think, primarily through the classical educational system, which is being eroded, and particular the Athenian example, and moving towards a kind of education which is, well, not just empty of meaning and purpose, but terroristic in many respects. So, for example, the cultivation of fear in the audience is obviously a technique of power. It's designed to make people feel weak, to disempower them, to make them feel that they have no purpose, no function in society, that they're just useless, kind of eaters and consumers. And I think this is a very dangerous, as you say, paradigm. And education is unfortunately promoting this paradigm very often, as well as popular culture as a whole.
Well, perhaps, just maybe, we're on the verge of a new cycle, a new renaissance. When we look at the history, since we're talking about, obviously, our guy was a great dramatist, and he understood the power of theater, and he understood the power of presentation before an audience. just as I would say the Greek masters obviously understood the power of the works that they were producing. But when we look at the cycle, if we want to truly go all the way back to Thespis, walking out of the Greek chorus and saying, "I am Dionysus," and portraying a god upon the stage, and we look at the pantheon of gods of Greek mythology, one could argue that there's a similarity happening today with all of the superhero movies and Marvel Universe and that type of thing that's going on. But what we can, I guess, hope for is what happens next is that next level of storytelling, which goes down to the nobility, the kings, the queens, maybe we do need an Oedipus Rex of our day type of a story. Maybe we do need a King Lear of our day type of a story now, and hopefully we'll transcend from stories about gods and myths to stories about the suffering of humans and real people. Of course, then it falls into Aristophanes and then eventually Menander takes it and we start the cycle all over again, right? But I'm just hoping that we're maybe coming out of this Menander-esque type of entertainment and we can elevate it to a higher level, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right. I also see this signs of this renewal. I think they're evident, despite all the doom and gloom that we can fall into and whine about the present, conditions. I think there are signs of a renewal because history has shown that it moves in cycles, it moves in circles. Trends come and go, and there are cultural trends, educational trends, and these are not static. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we can be optimistic that a new era may be dawning for humanity, because we've clearly reached the end of an era. I think all signs point in that direction, that we've reached the end of a phase, a cycle in history, and something new is inevitably going to emerge. And unfortunately, I think the price for that new thing will be great waste. But history has shown that. For something to be born, something has to die. So I think you're absolutely right, and I'm also optimistic, despite all the signs which we clearly see around us and everybody agrees on. I think that we may reconnect with earlier, more, shall we say, user-friendly tradition. More humanistic traditions than what we have at present, inspired by the Greeks or by other civilizations.
Well, let's pray it doesn't take another dark age and medieval times for us to experience a new Renaissance.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Yeah. Normally, it's always a contrast, a big contrast that it kind of alerts people to the value of something, that they have to experience something very different in order to experience the good that is missing. You're absolutely right about that. That's a very good point.
Well, the work that you're doing and the work that so many others are doing, I hope is helping to open the door, at least to some degree, if not even just a window, for a resurgence of the classics, because I think that the more we embrace that connection to that past, the better chances we have of avoiding that fall, avoiding that new dark age, by strengthening our connections to our ancient history. I think the foundations of Western civilization need to be embraced, and I think that hopefully holds the pillars up. That said, just a quick little side note, because I'm sure you can tell me, I just recently heard on the radio that for the first time in like 200 years, the scaffolding has come down of the Parthenon in Athens, and you can actually go see it now without there being any construction going on. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I heard it too. Yeah, a few days ago, the scaffolding that had been there to show works in progress, restoration of the Parthenon, has finally come down, and all my life I have seen this scaffolding there. And I was wondering, when is this work going to end? When are we going to see the Parthenon, complete? And apparently they've decided that now we can see the whole Parthenon rather than the scaffolding. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
I was recently in Barcelona and went, of course, to the Sagrada La Familia. And, the cranes and the construction sites and only, one whole side is blocked with tarps and tubes and tunnels and all this stuff going on. And my wife who'd been there as much as like 15 years ago. She's like, well, they have done a lot, but man, is it ever going to be done? And I feel like that's probably how some people felt about the, renovations to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, right? Because of the great fire that occurred years back, and that finally got completed and they took that down. But I heard the guy say on the radio, it's been about 200 years there's been scaffolding up. And for the first time in 2 centuries, I thought, holy moly, okay, I have to plan a trip to Greece now before they put the scaffolding back up.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also the question of the return of the marbles, the perennial problem, the British Library. Maybe one day we're going to have some of these, because the new Acropolis Museum, which was built during the Olympic Games in Athens in 2004, has left gaps in its kind of space for the marbles to be returned at some point and to be added to the existing structure.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It just goes to show you that, and I think that that's something that our author understood, is that, our lifetimes are really just a blink of an eye when we think of it in the greater scheme of history and the plan for the universe. But I think one of the things we find in Lear is his capturing of the age of the age, meaning that, Lear is mentioned in the script is 80 years old. They say 80 years old. Very few people lived to be that old during that time. And I think that that's also sort of part of the point he's making there. And also that no matter how old you live, human suffering continues, right? It's sort of part of the plan, isn't it? And another thing that he sort of points out there.
Yeah. I think that what I do, and perhaps I think what we do as Exfordians relates to that, because it tries to reconnect us to our past in a meaningful way. This is very important, because if you don't know your past, it's very difficult to imagine a future. It's very difficult to kind of see where you're going if you don't know where you've been. Like quo vadis, where are we going? And I think to begin to answer that question of where are we going in a meaningful way, we have to go back and see where we've been and reconnect with the traditions of in our case the Western tradition, which for me begins, let's say, with Socrates or Thespis, as you quite rightly point out, and seeing the development of culture through the ages and learning about how culture evolves, because it's not a static thing. We don't want to kill the thing. We want it to grow. So, but in order for something to grow, we must go back to the roots. That's where it grows from. It grows from certain roots, and you have to reconnect with those roots. And myth was traditionally the way that human beings understood the world. Then that was replaced, say, with religion. But today, and from Shakespeare's age onwards, I think art is now the medium through which human beings understand themselves and their lives, and is basically the modern religion. In modernity, post-modernity, art is the modern religion, and that's why Shakespeare is particularly important for us today. Not just important historically, but important for our cultural moment, because it is the means. Art is the means by which we understand ourselves as human beings. When religion is no longer a given that's universally, accepted and believed in. So Shakespeare is very, very important in all these things. And what we do, I think, is fundamental, because it allows us to reconnect with these values, which then allow us to imagine what the next day will be and where we're going as let's say Europeans or Americans or Western, peoples, whatever, or even citizens of the world, because Shakespeare's universal. He's transhistorical and multicultural. Is that's why he's so popular.
Well, I thank you, Nic, so much. It's been a very intriguing and entertaining conversation. His name is Nic Panagopoulos. I will spell it for you so you can find his work, and make sure when you search for his work, you just type in Nic, N-I-C, because there are a lot of Nicholas Panagopoulos out there in the world, and he definitely goes by Nic. And the last name is Panagopoulos. You can find his books. You can also find his essays. I have been really enjoying academia.edu, where you can find some wonderful essays on Shakespeare, including Nic's work. Also, I'm going to guess that at some point there will be a video presentation of his paper that he presented at the 2025 Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference, The Socratic Component of Hamlet. I would assume that'll be going to their website at some point in the near future. Nic, thank you so much for taking the time all the way from Athens, Greece, to join us here at Don't Quill the Messenger.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been a real pleasure talking with you and discussing these fascinating questions. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, there it is, fellow Quillers, yet another fascinating conversation with a fellow Shakespeare scholar from another corner of the world. Hey, won't you consider helping us to keep these fascinating guests coming? We are close to wrapping up our 7th season of episodes, and we are already planning the episodes for an exciting season number 8. It's hard to believe, but it is true. You can easily contribute to the program's future and continued success through our Patreon page, where you can choose a level of support that suits you and your budget. Every little bit helps with the costs of production and to keep those exciting guests coming our way. Plus, don't forget that if you join at the Serial Quiller level or above, you unlock the vast library of bonus feature episodes, and you qualify for our Quiller of the Month drawing for a chance to win a free item from the Quiller Swag Shop. This month, we want to thank and congratulate Courtney L., our November Quiller of the Month. Courtney, thank you for being a loyal Quiller. We hope you will display your Quiller item with pride and help share the Quiller Nation with others in the process. On this Thanksgiving Friday, the drop day of this episode, we are reminded how thankful we are for all of you out there, Quiller Nation. It is indeed our privilege and our pleasure to share this mysterious journey with you all. You make it possible, and you make it worth it. So thank you. And I am thankful for all of you and for my position here in this program as a part of this great exploration that we do together. That said, I have some very exciting news to share with all of you. I am bursting at the seams to tell you that it is official. We will be hosting a major Shakespeare authorship event in the Great Hall of the Honorable Society of Greys in London. The very hall where Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors first debuted during the Christmas revels of 1594. The very place from which Edward de Vere and so many other prominent members of the Elizabethan court graduated from with their law degrees. Yes, you will be able to join us in London for this exceptional event. Save the date. It is Saturday, May 9th, 2026. That's Saturday, May 9th, 2026 for the all-day event featuring live performances of scenes from the Bard's best plays featuring aspects of the law. Henry VI, Julius Caesar, Comedy of Errors, Hamlet, Measure for Measure, Merchant of Venice, and a dive into the hundreds of legal terms found inside the sonnets. it is going to be a magnificent day of exploration as we delve into the legal brilliance found within the Shakespeare canon. And we ask, was the writer of Shakespeare's works quite possibly the greatest legal mind of all time? Was he a graduate of the Inns of Court? This all-day event in the Great Hall of Gray's Inn will be preceded the evening of Friday, May 8th, by a preview event and cocktail reception at a local pub near to Gray's Inn. Attendees will get a taste of the Actors' Medal and an opportunity to socialize with fellow super sleuths. It's going to be a fabulous weekend. More details will be available, and early registration will open up in the coming weeks. But mark your calendars now, May 8th and 9th in London town. Flights and accommodations are at some of their lowest prices of the year right now, so you might want to start making your plans. Join our email subscriber list to stay informed and be the first to receive information about early registration. You can do that right from the link on the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. Don'tquillthepodcast.com. There is a link right there on the homepage. Click on that, add your email address, and you will be sure to be on the list to receive the information immediately when it is available, including links to early registration discounts. This event is co-sponsored by Don't Quill the Messenger and presented by Monumental Shakespeare. Details will soon be up and available at monumentalshakespeare.com. If you joined us in 2024 in Minneapolis, this event in London is going to be even bigger and better, with new scenes, new insights, and new revelations inside the Great Hall where all the major players once stood at some time in history. This is exciting. I cannot wait. I am, as I said, bursting at the seams. The actors are chomping at the bit to deliver their roles for you. And the legal professionals and scholars that we have lined up to make their presentations about these plays and the legal aspects within them is also very exciting. All those details will soon be available at monumentalshakespeare.com. Currently, you'll find details about our previous event, which just kind of gives you a flavor of what we do and how we do it. But all those new details will be coming very soon. Mark your calendars. Friday, May 8th, Saturday, May 9th, 2026 at the Honorable Society of Gray's Inn in the Great Hall. Be prepared to join us. So here we go, Quiller Nation. We will take London by storm and convince those who attend that it is valuable to explore these works, to mine them for their legal brilliance, and to always keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.